Okay, well, good evening, everyone. This is actually, even though I've only recently transplanted myself from Canada, as Joe explained in his very long introduction of me. Note to the chair, don't read the intros that people email you, okay? You just pick a couple, go on, and I should have shared half my time there with Frank, but recently arrived in this fair land as I am, this is the fourth time, I was counting it up, I've shared the podium with Frank at Politics in the Pub from various other trips when I was here. And I think that's awesome, first of all. Awesome for me, because every time we do, I not only agree with everything he says, but I learn as well. And I did that tonight. And I want to recommend the brochure, the paper that he and Chris wrote on wealth and equality, and that got some enormous media coverage this week. I don't know if you saw it. Some tremendous coverage in the media and online circulation, and it's very, very timely. Now, being from Canada, I was not fully imbued in knowledge of the wonderful Australian electoral system until this campaign, when I got to watch it closely and engage in it a bit. And so it was certainly a learning experience in every regard, to say the least, including, of course, the mechanics of the whole process, not just the politics of it, but it was a great opportunity for me to learn about the issues and dig into the issues and make some connections. Now, I come from a solid Gramscian tradition. So, of course, when we're talking about elections, I'm never just focusing on the election results in terms of who won what seats and that kind of thing. My tendency is to look at the sort of longer run battle of ideas that's going on all the time, of course, not just during elections. It occurs all the time. The battle, the struggle over, what sort of narrative of society, what is the common sense mentality that people accept and absorb that reinforces the way that society works. But that battle of ideas, of course, becomes particularly intense during an election, and people pay more attention to it during an election, which is probably why it's that is another reason why it's important to us, not just in terms of who wins the elections per se. My executive director at the Australian Institute, Ben Oquist, is fond of saying that we barrack for ideas, not for parties, is kind of a motto of his. And in this regard, I'm interested to know what was the outcome of the contest of ideas in this election, and parallel to the outcome of the battle of the parties. Because the reality is the capacity of any party, whether it's elected with a one-seat majority or an overwhelming majority, the capacity of any party to implement its policy agenda depends totally on the hegemony or dominance of the different ideas about how society works, the framework, the worldview that people accept. The government needs to have a narrative. They need to have core values embodied in that narrative. They need credibility that the whole story hangs together. Otherwise, I really don't think it matters how many seats you have in the Senate. And we learned that from the flip side of the coin when, say, Kevin Rudd was in power with the majority, but had no coherent narrative whatsoever, no values other than what's it going to take to get reelected. And by the way, commission a poll to find out what I should stand for, and so on and so forth. There was a very interesting column in the Australian yesterday that I read on the way to Sydney, and I meant to clip it, but I didn't, and I can't even remember the guy's name. Who's a male, sort of slightly pompous political columnist in the Australian, and I might...
Greg Sheridan, Paul Kelly.
I think it was Paul Kelly. I think it was Paul Kelly yesterday, who was making this exact point, which was really interesting, because I thought, you're a Gramscian here. You're actually viewing the world through the lens of this contest of ideas and what's required for his side to win. And he was berating Turnbull and the whole coalition by saying you don't have a coherent narrative, you haven't imbued your narrative with values, you haven't been consistent on the themes, and you have to be or you're dead. And it was kind of shocking. This is why you have to read what the enemy says, right? So that you can put yourself in their mind. So what I'm going to do is a bit of a scorecard on how I would view, imagine me as one of the Olympic judges, okay, in the rhythmic gymnastics, okay, and I got my numeric cards, 4.2, 6.0, and of course if I was a Russian judge it would be 7.0, right? And I'm going to hold up my scorecard in terms of how I think this battle of ideas unfolded in the election, and then think about what does that mean for our capacity as progressives to advance our struggles and our issues and our narratives in the months and years ahead. And I will, of course, focus on economic issues, given my interest and expertise, but I certainly recognize the importance of other issues that are out there, like obviously the human rights dimensions, this detention crisis, the refugee crisis, and the census.
Census.
Hashtag facepalm. You know, you honestly couldn't write shit like that, could you? In terms of discrediting the public's faith in government and civic space, you know, maybe that was their idea for all I know. So I'm going to list 10 dimensions of the battle of economic ideas, and then judge whether we won, whether they won, or whether it was a draw, okay? And if we won, was it a partial victory or was it a crushing victory, and vice versa. And again, this isn't just in terms of which party won and whose ideas were actually elected, but how even did the platforms change? There's a lot to be said in terms of how Labor's platform changed, how the coalition's platform changed in often surprising ways that reflected the changing balance of forces in that ongoing battle of ideas. And so that wasn't just about the election. I do want to put in one plug in this regard in terms of the battle of ideas. One of the first things we did through my new role at the Center for Future Work was a comprehensive evaluation, a statistical evaluation of the economic record of the coalition government, to challenge this common sense idea that right-wing governments know how to manage the economy. And it is something that's imbued in all the media commentary and a lot of the economics instruction, not at Sydney, of course, and elsewhere, that free markets and business are where economic competency is all about. And we went through and compiled historical data going back to Menzies on the actual real observed performance of Australia's economy, and then correlated that to which government was in power. And across those indicators, there's actually been no worse performing period in Australia's post-war economic history than under the Abbott-Turnbull government, which is interesting. So if you want to, it's a bit, you know, it was aimed at the election, of course, but I think some of the lessons there are still valued. Check the website, the website is futurework, one word, .org.au. I'll also give you my Twitter handle, @Jimbo Stanford, for those that are on social media. I don't know, by the way, this is a very anti-corporate crowd here tonight. Have you heard about this ridiculous merger that they announced today? Speaking of social media, where it's Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube all forming one conglomeration. It's like corporate concentration gone amok in social media, and apparently the new firm is going to be called You Twitface. You Twitface. So it's another venue where we have to challenge nefarious corporate concentration. You didn't see that coming, did you, Joe?
No.
You did not see that coming. Good.
10 out of 10.
Now we're even for that ridiculous intro you read for me. Okay, here are my 10 events. My 10 events in the electoral Olympics of the battle of economic ideas. Event number 1, trickle-down economics. Strong victory for us. They took it on the chin. The credibility of the whole claim that the way to advance the economy is to enrich the rich, further enrich the rich, and that this is going to pay off and it's going to unleash entrepreneurship and investment and activity and jobs and will all be beneficial. This is obviously a core idea of neoliberalism to justify neoliberalism. Neoliberals don't believe it, by the way. Don't believe for a minute that this is what they actually think. This is just argumentation to allow them to enrich themselves further and pretend that it's going to help us as well. And that idea was rejected. People do not believe it. Partly because of our counter-arguments, partly because of 30 years of history with neoliberalism. The reality is trickle-down economics does not do anything. It is not about growing the pie, it's about redividing the pie, and the rich have a very self-interested view of it. And this is important. This is important, and this gives us room to work on in the period ahead, because we can now start to enunciate a different vision of how to progress the economy that does not involve enriching the already rich. And this is important across party lines. The fact that this idea has suffered, and the fact that the Labour Party took on this idea itself, was significant and reflects both the times, their political calculations, but where did their political calculations come from? From the fact that people's ideas are changing over time. We're going to see it reflected, for example, in this debate over the banks. And the Royal Commission on the banks, and the banks not passing on the interest rates and all that. I mean, there's risks in this argument. It's kind of a populist hammer a big corporation argument. I think we could all benefit from a little more understanding about how banks actually work, but it certainly shows the weakness of the credibility of the traditional corporate rich-led vision of how the economy unfolds. So strong victory on that score. Event number 2. The fairness of the tax system and what we should do about it. Also a strong victory for us. The narrative that taxes are collected unfairly, that average people pay more than their share, and that powerful people get away with murder in the tax system, that description of the tax system is a bit overstated, and again there's a bit of a dangerous populism that's embedded in that, but also a healthy skepticism of some of the proposals that were coming from the coalition, both before and during the election. So this sentiment in society is what killed the GST. Their preferred vision, and they had all kinds of free market economists out ready to support it, is cut income taxes because they're a disincentive for more activity, and replace it with consumption taxes because they're more efficient and do less damage to economic activity. And it's bullshit, frankly. That's a technical term in economics. Bullshit. It means hypothesis unsubstantiated by empirical verification. Okay,
Very good.
So
Well done.
it's nonsense. It's again just self-serving propaganda to justify the redistribution. There's no evidence that the GST model, a sales tax or value-added tax model, is going to unleash all kinds of investment and entrepreneurship. Nor that income taxes, progressive income taxes, up to any kind of reasonable level that we can imagine, seriously disinhibits rich people from doing more, right? If anything, there's probably more evidence that the higher the tax is, the more they want to do, because God damn it, they want that mansion and that Lamborghini and that country home. And if the tax is higher, then they have to work a little harder to get it. So that was one before the election was even called. I think it also is why the corporate income tax cut is likely not to go ahead, at least not certainly in its full version. They will probably move ahead, probably with Labour's support for the first phases of it. It also influenced, think about this, the Liberals' positioning on the superannuation changes. That was surprising in a way that they came out and made those pronouncements, and it reflected the fact that they understood this tax fairness thing was getting ahead of steam out there. So they, at the same time as they were doing things that would make the system more unfair, the corporate tax cut in particular, and this higher threshold for over $80,000 a year, etc., they also felt they had to do something to make this, to acknowledge these vast injustices. And Labour keyed on 3 of them, of course, the super loopholes, the negative gearing loophole, and the capital gains loophole, and the Liberals took one up. And that was problematic for them. That was a hugely damaging decision by Turnbull for his own base and the coherence of his own community. And they're still going to pay for it. He's now trying to walk away from a lot of what he proposed because of that. Third event. It's not just a question in a progressive society of how taxes are collected fairly or not. There's also a question about how much tax we collect, because that determines what share of overall consumption in society is going to be in the form of public services, collective consumption, versus private goods and services that people buy with their own after-tax income. In this regard, I will cautiously say a partial victory. Labour was campaigning hard on the tax fairness thing. They were not campaigning as clearly on the issue of lifting the overall tax take from the economy. Now, the impact of their measures to close the loopholes for the rich would modestly increase the take, but not dramatically, and not enough to even reduce the reduction in the tax as a share of GDP that we've seen over the last 10 years in Australia. And they stayed a million miles away from anything that could be interpreted as a tax on an average person. Okay, so in that regard, the discussion that we have to have, that society is stronger when we do pay taxes, all of us, not just the rich guy over there, but all of us, that discussion did not really happen. And the left alternative on taxes is still pretty much let's tax the rich guys. And you can go a long ways on taxing the rich guys, but you cannot build an inclusive social welfare system just on taxing the rich guys. We all have to pay part of that. So I'll declare that a partial victory. Austerity, event number 4, austerity, and this idea that we must retrench the level of services in society in order to address the budget cut. I will also say a partial victory on that score. Important that the Abbott budget was roundly and historically not just defeated but denounced. And the coalition itself knew they can't do that anymore. So they themselves, again, even before the election, and this is where this vision of the battle of ideas is so important, even before the election, backed away from this idea that there's a budget emergency, we need dramatic immediate repairs to it, and we're going to have to take drastic action, whether that was in the form of spending cuts, which they would prefer, or tax increases. Just this idea that we have to immediately and dramatically cut the deficit was really watered down in the coalition's platform, and they ended up taking a very easygoing trajectory to their own plan to balance the budget. And that reflected the political damage that was done to them by the Abbott hockey austerity. So that's a good thing. Labour at the margins moved a little bit. Okay, so their budget plan made a bit of an incremental shift in terms of the timetable for deficit reduction. But I would say on the whole, Labour's narrative accepted to a large extent the need and the broad timetable for deficit reduction. Even though they moved it just a little bit, they got pummeled for it in the media, in the commercial media. The fact that it was going to be $16 billion over 4 years added to the net deficit before the budget was balanced because they were going incrementally slower than the coalition was. $16 billion over 4 years in a country the size of Australia. You can't even see that if you drew a debt to GDP ratio graph. And in fact, if you use the money to stimulate growth, you might end up with lower debt to GDP because you're growing the denominator instead of trying to shrink the numerator. You asked me about my fractional appointment, so there you have. That was a fraction. I made a fraction analogy there. Here's an interesting twist. Glenn Stevens, in his last ever public speech yesterday, came out and said this infatuation with balancing the government deficit is absolutely wrong-headed. And he pointed to things that we've been saying for years, that the personal debt is much higher and much more dangerous than the public debt. So there are ways in which we are chipping away at that edifice of austerity, and I give it a partial victory. Event number 5, the value of public services. This is slightly different than the issue of austerity per se. Austerity per se is generally motivated more by this fear about the deficit and so on. The value of public services is the ideology that supports the idea that we're going to provide those things in the public sector as a right of, belonging to our community rather than buying it. And here I would say it was a strong victory for us. Everyone's talked about the Medicare campaign, which obviously was important and came from all kinds of places, but reflected years and years and years of work and education and fightbacks against some of the incremental cuts that the government had brought into effect. It was not a scare campaign. That's that's how the coalition is trying to belittle it and complain that they were unfairly targeted by it, but there is a real struggle clearly going on in Australia over whether these things are going to be provided publicly or privately, and whether the public provision will be generous and equitable. Same goes for the years of fights around education funding in Gonski and the higher education system as well. So chalk that one up for a strong victory. Event number 6, inequality. I would call this a partial victory, and that public concern about inequality was part of the backdrop to all of those other debates that we were having, including about the tax fairness point, where I said we had a strong victory. I think it's quite clearly ingrained in popular economic common sense today that inequality is high, growing, and bad. Okay, and that in and of itself is a good thing for us, because that gives us things to work on, and the careful work of Frank and people like Frank to document inequality and highlight its concerns is crucial there. Here's an interesting thing about how the sands have shifted under the neoliberals' own feet. When we were having the debate over negative gearing and what it meant for the housing markets and how the benefits of negative gearing were quite skewed, and the Australia Institute did research on that was quite effective. Turnbull said at one point, this was hilarious, he said in a news conference where he was asked about the unfairness of the benefits of negative gearing, he said, well, of course most of the benefits go to people who own more houses. They're the ones who have more wealth. Okay? And he was like, they're the ones who own the properties. So if you're going to, give a tax credit for owning property and using it as a commercial asset, well, of course they're the ones who are going to get the benefit. It's like he couldn't understand the premise of the question, right? Because the public attitudes around this had run ahead of him. Event number 7, free trade and globalization. I would call this a partial victory. In the sense that the conventional bipartisan faith in free trade agreements and globalization has been damaged and public attitudes have changed. Did you notice the Liberal Party platform talked about going out and signing export trade agreements? Did you see that? They don't call it free trade agreements anymore, and that's not accidental. They've done the focus group testing and figured out free trade agreements doesn't have a good rep anymore. And that's, again, a positive sign. Calling it export trade agreements is ludicrous, right? Because hashtag duh, there's imports involved as well. And if you look at Australia's record of free trade deals, the imports are much bigger than the exports. In the case of Thailand, the free trade agreement with Thailand, they're 8 times bigger than the exports. The gains in imports from Thailand, including a lot of automobile products, 8 times bigger than the gains in new Aussie exports to Thailand, because Thai workers are too poor to be able to buy anything that Australia produces. So that itself was laughable. And it did not have legs. I don't think that position that we're going to go out and sign more, it was part of their plan, Frank, but not a convincing part of their plan. You had Nick Xenophon, who had, I'd say, a little bit of courage to come out and actually challenge the underlying policies of free trade in some important ways. Of course, you had the Pauline Hanson people who were going at it from a different view. I don't think they were really challenging the policy of free trade so much as the immigration and so on. You had Labour largely silent on the subject of free trade, trying to stay a mile away from it during the election, and they now face a huge decision regarding what to do with the TPP. The TPP could be stopped right here if Labour votes against it. That's clear. So there is going to be an enormous struggle within the Labour Party over whether they are going to do that or whether we're going to stay within the House and prove that we're respectable by supporting free trade. Item number 8, or event number 8, industrial relations. I would call it a draw. The debate over industrial relations did not turn out to be a big victory for the coalition, even though they manipulated the whole election to try and use IR and the ABCC issue in particular as a wedge. And it didn't work. It was laughable, in fact. I think most commentators realized the whole thing was a setup. And the fact that Turnbull spoke more about the ABCC in his bitter speech on election night, than he did during the entire campaign. That's actually factually true. He mentioned ABCC 6 times during election night, which was more than he mentioned it during the... What is it?
ACBB.
No, ABCD.
You guys don't know your
No. Are we doing fractions? Are we doing fractions or the alphabet? I don't know. Okay. Whatever it is, it didn't work. And they did not get a mandate from this for the next big bang in so-called labor market deregulation, which the people in the background of the party want, right? You know that they want that, and the business community wants that. Deregulation is still the euphemism for that. That's another great euphemism. It isn't deregulation at all. I've never seen a more intrusive, explicitly regulated system than exists here. But it's all about attacking the unions. On the other hand, I call it a draw because there was no clear counter-narrative to it coming from our side. The one partial exception to that was the fight over penalty rates, which was a tremendous grassroots public education campaign led by the unions, largely in their own name. and that was going on for 18 months before the election. That's a case study for me in how social movements can fight and win the battle of ideas by doing things like that, by picking issues that matter to average working class people and going out and mobilizing and educating around it. And I think that counts as a partial victory, although the victory was diluted by the kind of confusion over how does that get translated into an electoral demand. And Labour accepted the idea that it's the Fair Work Commission, the technocrats, so-called technocrats at the Fair Work Commission, that will make the decision rather than the elected government. So I give that one a draw. I've published a commentary on the flawed economics of cutting penalty rates that's on our website as well, futurework.org.au. Event number 9, sustainability. I give that one a draw. It was strangely quiet about environmental issues during the election. Labour had some not bad policies in their platform about it, but it wasn't a priority in their campaigning. I think they were all still intimidated by the success of the coalition on this carbon tax scare in the last election. The Greens, of course, had a more ambitious platform on this set of issues, but their effectiveness was compromised by the shenanigans that they did with the coalition around the Senate voting rules and the double dissolution and so on, to some extent. So I don't know. I'm still learning about how the politics work here, but I didn't see this as an issue where we really gained anything in the issue sense. Last item. This is an interesting one for me. The idea of planning and government responsibility for the economic condition of working people. I was intrigued, kind of in a humorous way, but I think there's something to it, by the Turnbull-Morrison plan. And they kept coming back to this idea of a plan. And they talked about it, and their plan for jobs and growth. And as Frank has already shown you, there was no meat in the plan. But the idea that they were coming out with a plan, considering they're neoliberals who oppose planning, how many free marketeers does it take to change a light bulb? One. You just hold it there and the free market does the rest automatically. So, but here they're the ones out talking about planning. And the idea that government has a responsibility to pull all the levers together around a focused goal. And the goal of jobs and growth, as long as it's sustainable growth, is a good goal. It's one that we're fighting for. So I thought that was kind of interesting, and I think it actually helped to create some space for us to develop our own plan. And this is where I conclude in exactly the same place as Frank did, that neoliberalism has been damaged. The ideological coherence and credibility and power of neoliberalism has been damaged by the election and by everything that went on before and up to the election. If I count up the victories there, I had 3 strong victories, 5 partial victories, and 2 draws in my list out of the 10. There's none of the categories where the coalition and neoliberalism generally came out stronger. We came out at least holding our own and coming out stronger on most of those areas. And if we can take this moment now to, in addition to fighting some of the specific electoral battles, and there could be another election before long, to enunciate our own coherent, comprehensive entry in that battle of ideas and describe a plan, that is also oriented towards providing Australians with the opportunity to work and produce and generate income and pay taxes and lift their living standards and protect our environment, and we can do that. We can devise and show a plan like that. Then I think we'll be ready to take this battle of ideas to the next step. So, thank you very much.